You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Saw the games. Physical
basketball
I was at the games.
versus
You were
physical
not.
fouling.
You watched them on YouTube.
Anyway,
I saw the games. I watched the games.
Well, we're here. I'm Bob Moats. Welcome to X's and Joes, a podcast dedicated to decoding the winning formula in college basketball.
And I'm Mike Wiemuth, welcoming you to episode 21, the 2024-2025 basketball season. Which teams are due for a regression or a bounce back? Recorded on the morning of Sunday, November 17th, 2024. So, Bob, we're talking about IU football and playoffs.
We're talking
the possibility of Alabama coming into Memorial Stadium. Like
hide the women and children. And this was, and I'm using that because a friend of mine, another coach was telling me it's like after a bad loss, it's like, hide the women and children. For college football, it's hide the women and children. It's that ugly right now for them. They don't understand how this is happening in this world, which is awesome for us because for the first time in not just our lives, our parents' lives, our grandparents' lives, since the dawn of time, IU football is a major national player. And I mean, yesterday was what a day, by the way.
Yeah.
When you hear 8 years, $72 million, you hear more in the assistant pool. It's like all of a sudden, it's like Pinocchio gets the fairy has come down and hit Pinocchio. We're not just a real boy. We're a five-star blue chip quarterback. It's not like he's just dancing around without his strings anymore. This is a real legit guy. So I'm befuddled, I'm dumbfounded, and I'm ecstatic all at the same time.
Yeah,
we're talking about playoffs in a legit way.
In a non-Jim Mora kind of way, right?
Right, in a non-Jim Mora type of way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, like with Cignetti's like contract, people look at the numbers and think, "Oh my God, that's just a lot of money." You think about like how many ADs what would they give up to be able to get a Kirk Cignetti like hire? Like that's all they like dream of is trying to get that hire that comes in and just completely turns the program around. So it's like you're told that you get the lottery ticket. The winning lottery ticket. You just have to pay a lot of money up front to get it. You're gonna pay the money to get the lottery ticket, and that's essentially what happened.
There are, I think, like fans are crazy. Like fans have, we're nuts, Mike. We know that. We know that because we do this as much as we do, and we think about this as much as we think about it. But think about if this was your job. Like you're an AD at a Power 5 program, Power 4, whatever the hell it is these days. Yeah. Some of them would sell their children. They would sell a child to get this opportunity.
Oh, absolutely.
Some coaches have like sold out their families to get this opportunity.
Right.
That's how because at this point, at this stratification, you're at a point where it's like, man, to get the crack at this type of to get a crack at this type of success, there is a old, Faustian bargain sort of approach to this. And Scott Dolson's done this completely above the board, just making the right hire and knowing the right people. And you look at the amount of money. Well, boy, it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
But think about how much it costs to park at Memorial Stadium, and think about how that translates now. Because now if you have more cars parking and Kurt Cignetti's brought them there, they've done the math. They know that for every dollar they're investing in this guy and this keeps up, they're getting $3, $4 ROI.
Yes, the ROI is definitely on the side of pay the guy. So it's sometimes you have to pay money to make money, as they say, right?
Or my joke was, we're just going to implode Memorial Stadium and just say we're going to quit while we're ahead.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like,
do the Costanza walk. I'm done. I'm
done. We did it. We did it once. That's all we got to do.
Yeah.
We're dumping it all in Lake Monroe.
Hey, what do you think about that debate you see happening on the Twitter sphere about like 3-loss SEC teams possibly leapfrogging 1-loss Big Ten schools?
Didn't we send Sherman to take care of this?
Yeah, exactly. That was literally my you and I think way too much alike.
We really do. It's like, didn't we? My great great grandfather rode with Sherman. I feel like I need to go to his grave and apologize to him for not upholding this.
Yeah,
I think there is this. And again, what is the anti-hot take approach to this, which you and I both subscribe to?
Mm-hmm.
It's a false debate. It's a false debate. And there is another portion of this, which is why you extended it to 12 teams in the first place.
Right.
On a 12-team playoff, you're going to get you should be able to get the right 12 teams. And I think that there's a legit conversation about maybe the Big 12, for example, being limited, or the Big East being limited. Or I'm sorry, the ACC. I always get confused sometimes, with that. The ACC and the Big 12 being a little more limited, and maybe it's not even a bias there, because you look at the top, middle, bottom of these conferences, and there's a distinction between the SEC, the Big 10, and then also the ACC and the Big 12 in that top, middle, bottom approach. So, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is it's a false debate. You take, they have enough analytics and metrics to look at this.
Yeah.
And, Georgia took care of business last night, as long as they keep winning, as long as Alabama beats Auburn and wins out. Texas is a no-brainer. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's what, 25% of the 12 teams?
Yeah.
Can you argue could you argue legitimately? I think you can, that the SEC probably deserves somewhere between 4 to 6 teams. Mm-hmm. And you could argue that the Big Ten deserves 3 teams minimally.
Right.
And then everybody else you can get, however it shakes out, I think.
Yeah, no, I'm just always interested in the fact that people really enjoy bubble debates, irrespective of the sport. Mm-hmm. Because that's what the drama is, right?
Yeah.
Oh, who's getting in, who's getting out? It's like, it's like the rope gate at Studio 54. It's like,
right,
okay, exactly who's going to make it through and who's going to be left out. So I think that's just sort of the nature of fandom, just enjoying that conversation.
You and I are standing at the gate, right? And Cheryl Tiggs walks up right behind us. We're like, we're screwed. Let's just go to let's just go to the Irish pub down the street.
That's definitely not our vibe.
We're not going. Yeah, we wanted to go in and check it out just because what the hell. And then Cheryl, okay.
Like you said, I'm very glad that when the events at Appomattox Courthouse took place, that college football was still something that was like 5-10 years down the road.
Right.
Because I mean, you imagine like if college football existed back then and you had this north-south divide in terms of like the teams, I think the Civil War would have gone another 2 years if Grant didn't give Lee some kind of concession on the SEC schools getting like some special treatment.
You guys get preferential bowl treatment for the first 10 years. Yeah. or no, we're yeah, I think you bring up a great point there. It's interesting that there still is a geographic divide, and it's almost like this SEC taking on the world right now, because you can definitely tell they're landlocked between Texas and Florida, Texas and Oklahoma to Florida, and they're just going to sit there, and they're going to be in. They're going to sit on their Masada, their Gibraltar, whatever they want to call it, and just fight the whole country, because damn it, they're going to do. That's what they do.
Yeah,
so
exactly. Lost Cause 2.0.
Lost Cause 2.0. And so that just again. So congratulations, Signetti, on a $72 million deal into Indiana University for that. For there, and basketball team starts 3-0. Very. winning and taking care of business in the metrics, which is what we have been talking about really off and on all summer, sometimes abstractly, sometimes directly, that it's not just about wins and losses. It's about how you win and how you play. And there's a lot to like. Would you say there's fewer question marks in this season than there were last year?
Well, in terms of what they're going to be like, or I think the question, you can have different question marks, right? Some question marks are on the downside. Oh man, like, how bad are they going to be at this, or how deficient? The question marks this year are a little bit more on the upside. It's like, really, okay, Rice, how much is he going to be able, how much more is he going to be able to add? Is he going to be a 15 and 8 guy like every night? That wasn't even on the table last year in terms of the kind of guard output. So yeah, I think there are questions, but I think they're definitely more on the positive, optimistic side compared to where they were last year.
There were moments I was watching yesterday, watching them play South Carolina. There were some times like with Archie Miller in the Marquette games, over or at least the Big Ten ACC, or Big Ten Big East Challenge games with Archie. There were a couple other games over the course, even when Jalen Hooskafina was with Woodson, or some of the Xavier Johnson games in the Big Ten tournament where you saw flashes. But looking at Miles Rice and realizing you have a presence that you haven't seen at IU since Yogi Ferrell.
Yeah.
And then watching Kanan Carlisle get into the action and the way that the two of them were able to play off of each other was impressive to see.
Yeah.
And again, if you watched yesterday, it's like Renew and Ballo did not have explosive offensive games, and IU still put up over 80 points, had just played phenomenally well.
Yeah.
And I think you have an opinion on that. Honestly.
Yeah. I know we were texting yesterday. I think you said, I think it was at halftime. We have 40 points and Ballo and Renew have only 5. I think I chimed in that, I submit that I think IU has 40 points because Ballo and Renew only have 5 points. Because, what we've been talking about, even in the off season, we discussed the ratio of output from let's say the bigs versus the guards. IU's definitely kind of been falling behind on that, right?
Right.
They've boys of late last few years, the bigs have been outproducing the guards, and that's really not what you want if you want to have a very modern system. And yesterday, I think was it Rice and just Rice and Baco and Carlisle had just as many points as Renew. And I said, going into this year, that's kind of what you needed to see, just that kind of like balance.
And Galloway chipped in 11 all in the second half. I think he hit free throws down the stretch. And you just saw different lineup combinations that some 3-guard stuff, some of the Mbaka with Goody stuff, just having Ballo and Renew kind of alternating the 5 sometimes in different areas. Tucker, I think, showed again why he's getting minutes. So you have a solid 8-man rotation. And that's something worth looking at as we're moving forward.
Yeah.
So speaking of solid, our title sponsor, our sponsor, Home Field Apparel. It's Christmas, and I think for a lot of you out here looking for the perfect gift for a parent, a child, that brother-in-law that just can't stop saying boiler up, and you feel like you got to get him something. And you don't want to just, and you want to keep some peace in the family. Home Field's got it for you. And whether it's t-shirts, sweatshirts, coaches' jackets, hats, you name it, comfortable, high quality material, and wonderful design conversation pieces for your college sports wardrobe at Home Field and at www.homefieldapparel.com. So when we come back, Mike and I are going to dig into the regression world and talk about this season, put some teams on some regression watches, as well as defining the regressions and defining which teams are going into them on that next session, or could be going into that next session when we come back on X's and Joe's.
Welcome back to X's and Joe's. I'm Mike Wiemuth, joined by Coach Bob Moats. So, regressions, what are they and why do they matter? So as always on this pod, we try to define our terms carefully. So what is a regression? Simply put, regression is just a drop in performance from year to year. Let's say 1 year you win 30 games and you go to the Final Four. Next year you only win 20 and you get bounced out in the first round. That's a regression. That's just a drop in terms of your performance from 1 year to the next. So why do they matter? Well, basically because every program experiences them. Even the most elite programs in the country have regressions. They're just a constant, regular pattern in college basketball. Coach K had probably arguably the most elite coaching career in the history of the sport. And he had 6 different regressions in his time in Durham, where his team lost 5 more games compared to the loss rate of the prior year. So, that's even with Coach K. You can have just multiple times where your team spikes up for a year and then the next year goes back down a certain amount. So, essentially, regressions are unavoidable. And one thing, just taking a look, and this episode is going to be a little bit more slide heavy than some of our other ones. So, we will remind our folks that listen to the audio only, we will be posting this online so people can check these out on their own time.
And we'll do our best to also explain the slides as we're going through them, so you at least know what we're talking about. This is also for us as well as the viewer.
Exactly. Yeah. So,
man, what a coach! This guy who is this? It's amazing.
Exactly. He's almost too good to believe.
He's almost too good to believe.
Yeah. So when you talk, and this is my experience when I talk to college basketball fans, oftentimes there's an assumption that's made about, let's say, the elite coaches, the Hall of Fame level type of guys that. And what their career path trajectory looks like. And on the slide I put up here, I call it just the assumption. People sometimes mistakenly believe that when a coach comes in to a school, and this being the school where they're going to have their Hall of Fame career, they will very slowly tick up the win-loss rate towards some kind of peak. And they'll do it very slowly in this sort of assumption, the belief that there's like a stepping stone of, say, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And then you hit a peak. And then at that peak, you're winning 90% of the games, you're going to Final Fours, winning championships, and you basically just stay within that band for, 20 years, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. You don't really dip down too much, and you just like constantly just rolling out Final Four visits, national championships constantly with very little drop off. That is oftentimes what some people believe a Hall of Fame career actually looks like. The reality is actually much different. When you look at the examples of Hall of Fame coaches, what you often see is something that's actually much more jagged. And in this slide that we put up here, we're showing an actual Hall of Fame coach. I didn't put the name up there just because it really doesn't matter, because this is a fairly consistent pattern you see with Hall of Fame coaches. In this example, this Hall of Fame coach started out his first year, he's at 50% winning percentage. And instead of a very slow climb, he spikes up very quickly to where in his third year at the helm, he's at a Final Four, and the fourth year he wins the national championship.
And
goes another Final Four. Go ahead.
Yeah, the next year he goes to another Final Four. So it's a Final Four, national championship.
Yeah, basically three Final Fours in a row. Yeah.
And should it also be noted that if you haven't figured out who this is just yet, ladies and gentlemen, he was an internal hire at the program he's at. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, exactly. So this coach, let's say his name rhymes with Lizzo.
And he doesn't play the flute.
Yeah, and he's still coaching in the Big Ten. So in this case, Mr. Tom Izzo had a drop off after his third Final Four. I think it was like year 6 going to year 7. He drops from 80% winning percentage down to 60. So that is very typical of any college football, or sorry, college. It also happens in college football, but college basketball coaches that specifically make it to their buyout, to the extension. As we said in one of the prior episodes, I think it was episode 2, we discussed what the difference is between coaches that quote unquote make it and don't make it. The coaches that make it to that second contract or the contract extension, the usual pattern is they win enough games by, let's say, year 3 or 4 to where they have a peak. And by peak, I mean whatever outcome is really considered to be a great performance for that school. So if you're at a school that has great expectations, yeah, it's going to be like a Final Four conference championship, AP top 5 finish. In this example, Izzo had 3 Final Four visits once he hit his peak.
So question on this as I'm looking at this, and we're seeing, I mean, you'll see like a peak and then a couple of years of the trophy and then a peak and then trophy.
Yeah.
Is there something significant about the 1 year down, 1 year rebounding, 3 year peaking, 4 year kind of plateauing, then back down again? At least before the transfer portal.
Yeah.
Is there something to be said about a junior year?
Yeah, I mean, so you're saying that basically the duration of the peaks and valleys?
Yeah, that honestly, that there's something about getting that class. There's a class that there's usually like in this case, you get the foundational class that Izzo got his first year.
Yeah, this is basically the Flintstones, obviously. That
right, and
leaves.
When they got to be juniors and seniors, that's when they were at their peak. He had 2 solid back-to-back classes, and then he had to reload. But it takes time for that reload to get the experience, to get the productivity up to being a contender.
Yeah, I mean it's in the pre-portal era, it was really essential to have some degree of durability in terms of the buildup, because one of the biggest distinctions between the coaches that have some longevity at their school and the ones that don't is that once they hit their peak, how long do they stay there? Like how many years, let's say above 80%, are you able to have, like the number of 80% or more win-loss seasons do you have relative to the ones that are below that? So you see that in this case, like on the line that we witnessed with Izzo, he's not really dropping below 60% more than, let's say, like 3 or 4 times, right? Mm-hmm. And there are many more times where he's above 75%. So I mean that's very typical of what you see with a coach that's going to stay for a very long time at their school, and in this case, a Hall of Fame type of coach. So you're right. I mean, you see many cases where coaches will spike up. They'll have like one very quick hot burning year where they win like 85, 90%, and they drop back down, but then they don't get back up very quickly. And so that's why I say, probably the three biggest variables when it comes to talking about regressions and why they have such an impact on teams. Where the big distinction is like the depth of the regression, like how big of a crash do you have from one year to the next? Are you dropping back, 20 Ken Pom points, or you're dropping back 50 or 60? So just how quickly or just how deep the hole you're digging that regression year counts a lot. The second thing is just the speed of how quickly you get back up. I mean, are you spiking right back up that very next season, essentially to where you were 2 years before, where you had a decently good season? Or is it taking, more than a year to bounce back to where you were just, the time at which you had some degree of success? And the third one is just, the degree of the bounce back. Like, how much are you bouncing back? Are you getting back at or above where you were at the times where you were having some degree of success, or are you just bouncing back halfway? Or you started say like 28 wins, you drop back to 20. You immediately got back to 28 wins or more, or you just get back to like 23 or 24. So that's what I mean by the degree of the bounce back. And those variables are really everything. If you think about it, like this conversation is so closely tied to our conversation around the chip stack theory. I mean, the particulars of the regression determine how many chips the coach loses as they're tumbling up or down the win-loss column. So this stuff is really just a parallel conversation to the chip stack conversation.
And if you also look at it from an asset, because how much did you build in your stack, which allows you to kind of go through a regression, and you're going to have a regression because teams need to have continuity. And we know that teams with some continuity plus talent equals performance and results.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where I'm going with this, where you see, okay, hey, when they're juniors and seniors, they're here, they're at the top, they're top performers. And then that new class comes in. And Izzo was kind of the one that said, okay, when my seniors are leaving, I'm going to bring a whole new group of freshmen in with a foundational backbone type class and then fill in. So he would get a 4 or 5 recruit group every 4 years of high level, fill in from there, and then just ramp them back up. And he put his kids through a meat grinder. Like his schedules, he never said, okay, we're going to do a crappy schedule just to get a tournament. He was going to go, we're going to go on the carrier deck and play the best country in the world and maybe get beat by 20. We're fine with that because I want my kids to go through this. So by the end of the season, they're playing their best. We're hitting our stride. And we are a 7 through 10 seed. We have a shot at this thing.
Yeah. Izzo's like his early season records were not indicative of the actual strength of his team once they got into March. That's very true.
Which is why you're looking at 80%. If you're looking at the thing, 80% peaks versus 90 to 95% peaks.
Yeah. And with 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. Basically, let's see,
a slew of Final Fours.
8 Final Fours. Yeah.
And the last Big Ten. The Big Ten coach to win a program to win a national championship.
Yeah, exactly. If you and we kind of and you can do this exercise with any coach that of any stature. This example I have here, you have Matt Painter, and you see when you do this exercise, you can just drawing the line, whether you look at win percentage or total wins, however you want to do it, you're going to see the same line appear for almost all coaches. It's going to be a jagged, up or down. It's going to be, essentially is going to have peaks and valleys. And what you can identify within the peaks and the valleys is basically what the roster cores look like. This example on Painter's and Painter's been at Purdue 19 years now. You can identify the teams that are basically pulling the numbers up in terms of the kind of players. So at the peak here for Painter in his first 5 years, you basically have the baby boilers. So that was the E'Twaun Moore, Robbie Hummel, Juwan Johnson teams. They hit their peak. Peter gets them about like an 81% win percentage. Then you have the drop off after they leave, and then you hit a trough in what I call the Johnson years, and were those Purdue teams that look like remind me of that what was that town from Blazing Saddles, Rock Ridge,
yeah.
Everyone in town is named the Johnsons.
Named the Johnsons, yeah.
Purdue at their worst had a roster that looked exactly like the town roster, Rock Ridge from Blazing. And was it Anthony Johnson, Tyrone Johnson, Ronnie Johnson? At any given time?
I don't know. It was and it wasn't good. I mean, it just.
I think AJ Hammonds was like the one big they had. So that's the decline, and then the ramp back up. The ramp up again happens once you get Carson Edwards. And that team that came within just was a 0.2 of a second from going to the Final Four before bowing out to Virginia. Mm-hmm. So they spike up again with that team. Then they drop back down. You have like the Matt Harms teams of the early 2020s, and then they spike back up again with Zach Edey.
And that was the 2020 year when they actually were going to not make the tournament, even though they were in the top 24 of the top 25 of KenPom.
Yeah.
They weren't going to make it because they were a 500 record team,
Mm-hmm.
which was, again, an anomaly inside KenPom. And there they are, plummeting to rising. But that was also no Gel Eastern had, you had a guy on the floor that really wasn't a threat to score at all.
Yeah.
And no one to, that was, I think Travion Williams came the next year, and that kind of started the Williams Edey resuming of the big man approach.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously, Painter is considered by many to be one of the most, I guess, resilient coaches. If you think about just going through different iterations of roster changes. And even with him, I mean, you see he has these ups and downs, just like you'll see with any other coach. So I think the point we're trying to drive home is the fact that no matter how good of a coach you are, you're going to have these undulations in your performance. And it's going to be driven principally by just the changes in your roster. A lot of it will be talent. I mean, that's the obvious one, but some of it is also just the sort of player mix, the kind of toolkits that each of the players have. Do they get along? Do they have some degree of experience with each other? How long do they actually spend with each other in terms of their time at the school? So it does just highlight the fact that, no matter how good of a coach you are, you're going to have this happen. And so for fans, the media and all that, it's we tend to see overreactions to these undulations, oh my God, what's happening? And so I think we're trying to get people to kind of maybe take a little bit more of a 30,000 foot look at coaching tenures to be able to understand how these things actually how they happen and how they relate to other coaches as they're going through their spikes and valleys.
And that kind of goes as we go to Bob Knight and talk about him briefly. Reloading takes some time. Rebuilding is you have an extended trough, and usually a rebuild starts with a coaching change. Rare is the situation where the coach, after an 8-year dip, just all of a sudden re-ramps himself up.
Right.
It's reloading though, I think I want to qualify this by saying it used to be a 1-2 year process where you would have, with IU, as we're looking at not Coach Knight right now, they win the national championship in 87, have the drop off to the 5 seed in 88, where they lose in the first round, and then have a Sweet 16 that should have been a Final Four team, a Big Ten championship winning team the next year with Jay Edwards, Lyndon Jones as sophomores, Eric Anderson as a freshman. And then Eric Anderson was able to kind of be there for that for his Final Four run.
Yeah.
That's more the thing where the reload may take a couple years, and when you're talking 60% to 80% wins, Mike, you're not talking about that much of a variance, are you?
Yeah, not really. I mean, it's
4 games, 5 games.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a 30 win, in a 30 to 35 game season. Yeah, a 10% variance is just 3 games. So 20% is about 6 games. So you're right. It's not. It's obviously just the relative numbers, right? So if the difference between, let's say, if missing the tournament is let's say the line is drawn around 18, 19 wins, and being, let's say, a 6 seed is 24 wins. So yeah, I mean, that's your 20% right there.
Right around.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, looking at Knight, we all kind of know the story here with him, and then that end where a recruiting class did not pan out the way that they thought it would. That reload class with Patterson, Reed, and Miller were not as productive as Cheney, the Grahams, and Nover and company, who weren't as productive as Alford and Thomas and the JUCOs. So you kind of go back through the years and you get that impression. I think that's what's important about looking at this, is that sometimes and I think Izzo ran into this last year also, where he graduated a bunch of seniors who did not produce at the level that the fan base, the program expectations were used to. Yeah. And then the questions, and we had the questions in Bloomington, they had the questions in East Lansing. I think for a time they had them in, even places like Chapel Hill, where, or, never. And I mean, where they just, it just never really, well, are we sure that, well, does the old man have it sort of crap?
Yeah.
Well, he's still winning 23, 24 wins a season. It's just, it's just not to that top tier.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I think Knight and Izzo have very similar tales right now in terms of their win-loss line on their career. Boeheim had a little bit the same as well. Because it's not necessarily a crash. I mean, it's interesting. People oftentimes think, well, when a coach gets let go, or a well-established and esteemed coach is quietly asked to leave quietly, oftentimes it's just a leveling out. It's not a crash. I mean, typically coaches that just like literally fall through the floor. I mean, that's what people are kind of used to. Teams that just don't get anywhere near the NCAA tournament. With a lot of these other coaches, the ones that have a degree of success in their past, especially like the really high performing ones like Knight and Izzo, you sometimes do see just sort of like a flattening. It just, they don't necessarily drop down into the NIT and sub NIT levels of play. They just hover around 18, 19, 20 wins and just kind of stay there.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
And that kind of is, as we kind of look at the next one, moving forward here, the levels of success, briefly touching on it, is that a regression can be going from that top 2%, which is the 1 and 2 seed, to that 3 through 5. Or if you're a 3 through 5 team, dropping down another one into that, everything from that 6 seed to on the bubble. When you think about it, the top 15% of college basketball is where everybody wants to kind of stay once they get there. And you want to spend more time in the top 5% if you're an elite program than you want to spend in the top 15%. Rare is the program that goes from the top all the way to 95 or 65 in Ken Palm. Those are more the outlier situations. And as we kind of go through this conversation this year, keep in mind that when we're talking about some of the programs this season, it's going to be a matter of, it's not that they're going to be bad. It's just they're not. It's a matter of they're going to just take a bit of a step back. And the question is it going to be a trend, or is it going to be a one-off, or kind of is it the start of a reload? And how are they reloading? Are they reloading in the traditional high school recruiting sense, or are they looking to quickly jet up with, trying to fill in with some transfers to bridge their next generation of player?
Yeah. Exactly.
So the question there, and we're gonna kind of start with Purdue. But before we start with Purdue, we're gonna start with another black and gold team that a lot of IU fans are familiar with. The idea of losing a big producer, and how that impacts the rest of your team. And I think Iowa, when we were talking about this before the show, Iowa was the one that really seemed to make the most sense. By the way, the Bison is taking on Fran McCaffrey in our graphic. Have you noticed that?
Exactly.
There's a headbutt going on, and that's actually really funny.
I try to find the most. I literally put the Fran McCaffrey red-faced in the search engine, and I came up with a good one. But yeah, I think the Bison is getting in the way, but that's totally fine. Yeah. In the example, when we talk about, why the teams sort of like, spike and decline. And again, so much of it is dependent upon the players involved. Some of the biggest impact is not just having, let's say, a good player or a set of good players. It's having enough players that are able to buoy the rest of the players on the team. And what we notice, if you look in the data over time, you see this effect on, let's say, supporting cast on a team. When a supporting cast player has really good players with them, it basically spikes their numbers above what it would be if that stud player was not on the roster. So I use this example here with Jordan Bohannon from Iowa. In his time, in his progression with his box plus minus, as he was going through his time at Iowa with Luka Garza. So Garza obviously was a Big Ten Player of the Year, stud player. Where's he playing now?
No clue. I mean, honestly, it's like,
He was playing for
clue.
Denver, or well,
Maybe.
he was in the NBA.
Yeah.
He was in the NBA.
He's in the NBA, or has been. Yeah, he's got. Yeah,
Yeah.
and he did so in the as a 4-year college big man. So
Exactly. So Garza, his second to last year, he was at 11.7 BPM, which is obviously, again, anything above 10, you're about an All-American player. So that's 2020. 2021, he spikes up to 13.7, that's like getting into National Player of the Year territory. Bohannon, at the same time, in his, of course, Jordan Bohannon was on the Bluto-Blutarski plan in terms of his time at Iowa. I believe he had 3 senior years in Iowa City.
COVID, he took it. Yeah, and he also had a great fireworks deal too.
Exactly. So
one of the first NIL deals was him going to a fireworks stand. I love that one. I mean,
exactly. Here are, folks.
There's $150 and all the bottle rockets you can shoot off.
Yeah. So Bohannon. So what would you see? We were looking at 3 different years for Bohannon. So his first senior year, he was at 3.2 box plus minus. Going into the next year, which is Luka Garza's All-American year, Bohannon's productivity spikes up to 6.1. So it goes from 3.2 to 6.1, almost basically a doubling from 0. Now, in his third senior year, he loses Luka Garza. Garza graduates, goes to the NBA. So he goes from 6.1 down back to 4.5. This is a very typical event when you see supporting cast members losing those All-American teammates, is that their productivity does not continue to rise. It typically will fall back or basically regress back down to a level that you presume is sort of the more natural positioning for where they are.
And thinking about Garza as a post player, and thinking about Bohannon's final senior year, he also had the Murray twins that were in their sophomore year. Yeah. And Keegan Murray had lottery pick All-American numbers. I mean, I think his BPM was actually higher than Garza's. Yeah. And Chris Murray was in the 9s. So he was definitely, so you had 2 players that were kind of national players. You would see BPMs on a national contender, but the rest of the guys around them were kind of just, we're kind of, the best way to kind of look at that. The progression was a little bit less than just because I think the impacts of the players were different. I'll put it that way. Yeah.
And it's interesting because it also depends just the kind of player it is. It's not just having an All-American. It's like, are they kind of guy that really does help out the rest of the team? Or they really demand more double teams than the others? Because if you have a guy that just goes out there and just shoots a lot and doesn't really distract the defense or causes the defense to collapse on them, that's probably not going to have as much of an impact as a guy that is just constantly attracting defensive attention. So
the Murrays definitely attracted a lot of defensive attention. I just think it was done differently, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Done differently, that it wasn't like they were digging the post, which for Bohannon, digging the post meant a great deal for that.
Yeah.
And how they function in the ball press together, how they did all the, the chemistry was different, where you get and again, that's that senior year regression that we talk about all the time here too, where sometimes when you have multiple senior years, guys will regress in performance. Iowa also, really kind of, and I mean, I think and I don't know if we really could say they had a regression or not in that situation, but it was a situation where Bohannon, where you start noticing that if you take away a pivotal post, like a pivot player, a post player down low, who is attracting double, triple teams, where they're designing defensive schemes just to contain guys like Bohannon, who are great shooters, maybe not great drivers, find themselves, their productivity gets compromised a bit.
Yeah, exactly. And it varies. I mean, it's like, if you do this exercise, let's say for like 100 players, more often than not, they're going to have this regression, but some of them don't. Some of them just like, keep going. And like I said, there's a degree of variability. Well, I think we're trying to emphasize is to folks is to understand that like at least the incremental trends are that these all-American type of players have this ability to sort of pull up the rest of the supporting cast on their team. And when they leave, then there's a general tendency for the supporting cast not to be able to hit the same numbers that they did that they did when that all-American type of player was on the roster.
So what you're saying here is that Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer may not necessarily have major regressions, but it's possible.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when you think about a player like Zach Edey, and just in terms of like what they can do. I don't think I've ever seen a player that just kind of disfigures the defense the way Zach Edey could, especially as a big guy. I mean, that's like something out of you watch old game tapes of UCLA when Lou Alcindor played there. It's crazy. I mean, literally, you'd have like 3 or 4 guys around him, and you could just like, okay, am I going to take the hook shot here, or am I just going to pass out to someone who has a jump shot with nobody within 15 feet of him?
Right. Can you pop up the Ken Palm real
Absolutely.
quick? Ah, there we go. And I don't think I have control of that, but if we do, and not, we're going to kind of just leave it there for a second.
You got it.
Okay, cool. So when we talked about the regression, you look at Matt Painter the last couple seasons, and you're looking at a top 2% team. They had back-to-back 1 seeds. Did they have a 2 seed in 2022? I can't remember, Mike. Was that when they lost to St. Peter's?
St. Peter's, yeah, I think, yeah, they were a top 3 seed. Yeah.
So they were a top 3 seed, and then now they're kind of in that situation where you could look at that 3 to 5 range is where they are now. And we're not really sure yet. And again, we're doing this on the heels of them beating Alabama convincingly at home, which helps their resume and their metrics. We're not really sure how this is going to look over the next, what would you call it, month, as you look at their schedule now, and how it's a very difficult schedule to say the least.
Yeah.
And we're not, so even with this type of regression, losing Edey, they're kind of on regression watch. They may not be, we're not saying Purdue's going to jump down to that 20 win. Are they on the bubble? Maybe limping in with a 9 or a 10 seed sort of approach. What we're kind of looking at here is, do we see a step down? And then does that indicate, based on recruiting over the next few years, could Purdue be in a position where it's where the Matt Painter model may no longer work for them?
Right.
And I think that's kind of the question.
Yeah, and by Painter and the model, I mean like mostly focusing on development of high school players, not using the portal that much,
and also looking at guys that are maybe out of the realm of possibility, or kind of going with players that are very skilled in 1 or 2 areas of the game, but have significant deficiencies in other areas.
right?
Basically creating unicorns, and from Carson Edwards to
Jaden Ivey,
yeah, because Ivy had a lot of those. You had a lot, obviously had something,
yeah,
because he's playing in the league now, much like the others have. But and then up to Zach Edey, at least 2 of those 3 players, most Power 5 coaches are like, we're not really sure about them.
right.
Painter turned them into highlight pieces.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I think is pretty essential when you kind of look at the Painter approach. Will other programs be able to kind of figure that out, or will he have that sort of trough that comes into play, like we were talking about with some of the other coaches, where maybe a team or 2 doesn't work out? So you put him on regression watch, because it goes back to when we looked at Painter's slide, and now you look at it as a history, and take 2020, take a look at the win-loss records there. And they're really good in the metrics, but you look at, from the baby Boilers to the Johnsons to Carson Edwards to where they are today, and they seem to have some talent. You know, that it's going to be a question of can they repeat what they've done with their talent?
Yeah. Do you think it's interesting? Like, I feel like Painter, in a way, just kind of leans into what he's got in the way that some like people say, well, Painter's got this system. And I think he does, but I think if he has a Carson Edwards, he's like, okay, we're going to shoot a crap load of threes. That's what kind of did with that Elite Eight team. I mean, remember those games in the tournament? They were hoisting like 30-some, 40-some threes in the game. I mean, just a constant shootouts.
Right.
Then it's like, holy crap, now I get Zach Edey, a once-in-a-generation talent, but he's a big guy. He's 7'4". Well, I guess we're not going to be taking as many threes now, or I'm going to be using him as a means of either getting a lot of layups or then forcing the defense to collapse and kicking out to guys for really wide open threes. So I think he's very smart in the way that he has a system, but it has a degree of player dependence that a lot of people like maybe not appreciate. And it's like, I'm going to leverage this guy to make the rest of the team really good.
He's built a half court concept and constructs that actually play to his players' strengths incredibly well.
Yeah.
And he's learned how to penetrate the ball effectively, getting the ball into the paint to collapse defenses. So when it was Isaac Haas and Matt Harms, and if you want to leave, please leave that up, because we're going to keep that, because we're going to keep referencing this. But when it was those guys, they were bigs who could stretch a floor. So he didn't have to necessarily put him in the post as much as he just wanted to get him in movement. So off the zoom action, they didn't have to roll necessarily. They could pop out of it.
Yeah.
That sort of area. And so all of a sudden, Haas could hit a 3-point shot, which is forcing the defense, putting pressure on the defense, making the help a lot bit more difficult.
Yeah.
Travion Williams was an amazing passer out of the post. So he penetrates hitting Williams in the post, and he can then kick it to Ivy, who can either shoot it or drive it.
Yeah.
And so he's built into he's from a tactical standpoint. Strategically, he gets he's figured out where to get his guys, and he uses his tactical approach to get the ball where it needs to go based on how the defense is deploying.
Right.
It's what makes them so good offensively.
Yeah.
The real question becomes if you can single cover them. If he has a team that can't, and the jury's still out on this, because Trey Kaufman-Renn had a really good game and has had some really good performances against. And I think you and I were texting that it's like, hey, Trey Kaufman-Renn at the 5 looks like a really good idea.
Yeah.
Do you go with Will Berg now that the other kid's down for the season and is going to be medically
got hurt?
Yeah, hurt. Do you go with that and you just ride with some small ball concepts with Trey Kaufman-Renn in the 5? Maybe it just looks a little differently.
Yeah.
Another team that's facing this, this bit of a dilemma is Tennessee. And it doesn't look like they're on a regression watch because of where they are with the KenPom rating, but losing Dalton Connect, I think puts them in a position where you start looking at, some of the numbers, and their first real test looks like it's going to be, you might argue, Virginia on a neutral court. And are they, I don't know where they're going on that. It looks like they're going someplace.
They play Illinois eventually, right?
They play Illinois eventually, but I'm thinking are they going to one of the like Thanksgiving feast week type events? Because it looks like they are.
Yeah, I think I'd check their schedule, but I thought they were doing one of the special ones.
So much like a lot of programs, their first, some of them get tests early in the game. Others, as it moves forward, as you go into the thing, that Thanksgiving is kind of the first checkpoint as to who's legit, who isn't.
Right.
Would you? Yeah. So we may get a better idea for them if they stay in that sort of top 2% field going through the season, or if we start seeing them going to be moving towards the bottom of the top 3%.
Yeah.
You start seeing them more in that 16 to 24 range inside KenPom and Torvik. That indicates that their seeding isn't there necessarily. They're shooting the ball well. It looks like they're definitely shooting it well. Definitely from 3. Better than they were when they played IU, and their defense has looked like that hasn't moved all that much either.
Yeah. I mean, they brought in a few I mean, they brought in some decent transfers. So I know
But
what the Lanier kid from North Florida came in,
Okay.
and Milicic from UNC. I think it was UNC Charlotte. So,
but are any of them at the level of Dalton Connect was a year
oh
ago?
no, I mean, yeah,
Not
it's
even-
going to be a collective effort, and obviously, the Zakai Ziegler. I mean, he's one of the 3 best defensive guards in the country, so he's going to shut down a lot of people.
And Tennessee definitely builds defensively. They've always been a defensive build. So those would be examples as you're looking through the year as to programs that might be facing a regression overall team performance. Tennessee definitely fits that, and Purdue, because they're losing such a transfigural player for their team, high utilization player for their team.
Yeah.
And how do you replace that? And it looks like both programs are going to look to do that in the aggregate versus finding a replacement.
Yeah.
Along the same lines, I want let's talk about. Let's look at Baylor. I think we were watching Baylor earlier this season. Play Gonzaga.
Yeah.
And Baylor versus Gonzaga was not pleasant, to say the least. Yeah. One thing, if you look at a Ken Palm, for example, and I'm scrolling down it now, you're looking at minutes continuity. This is one of those deep down on Ken Palm or Torvik or any of the other types of sites where you start even just looking at, let's say, a verbal commits. Right now, I think if you look at where their roster is being built, they had to replace a great deal of they had to replace a lot in the aggregate.
Yeah,
they're young.
Yeah, they lost Jacoby Walter to the Raptors, I think, and then Ray J. Dennis and Jalen Bridges, and was that Yee's Missy kid went to the Pelicans, I think. So
now they bring in a guy like VJ Edgecombe, who is going to who by all intents will be a really good ball player. He will be a really good ball player. They got Jeremy Roach from Duke, who is and that's where you have that sort of player that can kind of come in as a transfer and help kind of bridge the gap.
Yeah.
They have I think they're going to have another good class coming in next year too.
Yeah.
So they're kind of in that sort of, you put them in regression, even though again, they're looking, they're 16. Yeah, that's true. They were 15, 16. They're kind of where they look like they are, but in the Big 12 over the course of the season, you can see them drop out of that top 5% into the top 15%.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're at a loss of missing the tournament, but they are definitely in a position where they may not, they may be looking at that higher seed versus other programs that are, on that ascendancy.
Right. They seem like one of those teams that's going to have a very high ceiling and a low floor.
True. And they'll surprise some teams. They will definitely surprise some teams.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, within the same week, they lost to Gonzaga by like 30 something. They got absolutely steamrolled. And then they went and beat Arkansas. And Arkansas was ranked. So, so that's very typical of a team that has talent, but the talent is typically young and maybe they just haven't played together very much. So you're just going to have this constant cycle maybe of like really knocking off a really good team and then just getting boat raced by another team. So that's not untypical of these kind of teams.
And if you're looking at, Scott Drew and what he's done, and definitely his best teams are the ones that are very high defensive efficiency teams. Offensively, they're always going to have firepower. So it's going to be a question of, over the course of the season, can he get their defensive cohesion better? Can they put the pressure on the ball, pressure on the passing lanes that we've seen in the past from a Gonzaga?
Yeah.
And be able to build them in that area. And if you want to go, actually, would you mind, because I know you have a couple slides that kind of show this building in the aggregate. Speaking of Baylor, we have some Baylor slides to put up real quick.
Oh yeah. And of course, Jared's going to get on me because he jokes about how often I talk about that Baylor 2021 team. So so I know I'm going to hear something about that. Yeah. I think within our network, what does Wiemuth mention Baylor 2021 more or less than Morris mentions the 93 IU team? That seems to be like the race
Kind of, yeah. It's kind of like we could only get a drinking game. It's like when, or just set the over under in the X's and Joe's episode of when Mike's going to bring it up.
Yeah, I know. If you ever want to really get under Jared's nerves, just mention Henderson's knee injury. That's the one way that he will come after you.
He's not alone. He's not alone.
But everyone's like that in some way. Yeah. So
you see the Jared Butler Baylor team.
Yeah.
The
so
one
we're talking about again. We're sort of talking about the building of rosters and also just the stability of the development of the players within a roster that's fairly stable, and frankly, just with a stacked roster with a lot of good players on them that are going to be playing at the same time as the other players. You're not having a lot of drop ins and drop outs of the roster. So this slide, this one we actually used before in one of our prior episodes. We're talking about the progression of a player. This is Jared Butler from Baylor, who played on their national championship team in 21. So he's a 3-year player, went to the NBA. He had and this is a fairly normal, let's say, development curve. His box plus minus in year one was 3.7, which is really good for freshmen. Spikes up to 9.3 his second year, and then was 11.7 his third year, which again, is like all-American level. And if you look at why he was able to do that and have that kind of curve is partly dependent on the fact that he had a lot of other good players around him at the same time. In his third year, which is the year they won the championship, he had 3 teammates that were all above box plus minus 8.0, which is, as I said before, it's kind of the dividing line in terms of like measuring championship level teams versus ones that aren't. The more 8+ box plus minus players you have, that typically is one of the biggest dividing lines between championship teams and ones without. Right. So in this case, they had 4 of them: Butler, Mitchell, Teague, and Flagler. It helped, obviously, that they were all, sort of upperclassmen, at least 3. And even the fact that, many of them were transfers doesn't really matter. That's where when we discuss, sourcing of talent, it's not even so much where the players come from as long as they're staying together. And a lot of these guys were multi-year transfers. So they were able to develop together, and by the time they get that championship year, they're at 8.0 box plus minus or above, which we
could argue that's what Drew's maybe looking at doing with what he's bringing in this year with the recruiting class, and then next year's recruiting class that
right.
It hopefully doesn't. The regression kind of stays where you want, stays within tournament range,
right?
But in 2-3 years, assuming that he doesn't get early entries or portals moving out, which he may. I mean, Edgecombe could be a player that you could look at shooting the draft for.
I think he's probably might jump, but but the core of the team, as long as you're retaining some of them and they're developing together, which is
right.
Really, as a coach, is what you want.
That's what you want.
Yeah, because it's you're always sort of fighting that challenge of like knowing, okay, if the kid is really, really talented, I might only get them for a year. And a lot of those kids may not produce at like, 8, 10, 12 level box plus minus. Till we only see that with guys that are a little bit more experienced and also have NBA talent at the same time.
Right.
So that's why, on X's and Joe's, we always say you shouldn't necessarily turn away from one and done type players, but you probably don't want to build a whole roster of them because just
right.
the turn rate is just too much, and you start to get the problems that John Calipari had his later years.
And if you have a chance to get Cooper Flag, you get Cooper Flag, but you at least want to maybe run actions where you're not trying to force it down their throat 3 straight possessions against the Mark Kentucky team.
Yeah.
Which kind of again takes us to when we look at the next thing, when we look at where IU. If we look at where unstable talent, even though the talent was good coming into the movement, based on on our recruiting metrics, we thought the movement and the year that the group, the Vonleh group, the next year was going to be pretty good.
Yeah,
the pieces weren't all that complementary, and
exactly.
So you see a player like Will Sheehy going from a national championship number of 7 on BPM lower. And that does kind of impact the program's win-losses, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you look at this case, Will Sheehy, year
He
one,
goes back to earth. Yeah.
what's that?
He goes back to earth.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he has a fairly normal progression for a quote unquote good player. He's box plus minus around 1 his freshman year, very common. He spikes up to just under 4 his sophomore year. Junior year, the year, which had been 2013 when he's surrounded with all that talent, he's up to 7, which is, again, become a player you would typically see on the rotation of a national championship level team. Then while those players are gone, he's back down to a 3.
Mike, what do those players look like?
Well, I'll tell you, Bob. So in terms of the losses and the actual output of those guys, you had Zeller and Oladipo were both lottery picks. Zeller's at 11.1 BPM, Oladipo 15.1. So again, anytime you see guys above 10, it's not only that they're producing, it's that, again, they're yanking all the players around them higher than what they would if they had not been there. And so obviously you saw that with someone like Sheehy, but you also had Watford and Hulls. Also, they were above 8. So again, you had 4 guys above that 8 line, which is, again, where you would see typically the team that is capable of competing for a championship. And then they leave, and then all of a sudden Sheehy's not able to hit that same mark, and he declines.
But again, and the program's overall performance declines from a 3 national ranking in Ken Pom, number 1 team.
Yeah.
And really kind of showing kind of the cracks in what was happening inside the program. So that's also, as we go on to the next one, and we look at the comparison, like a Scott Drew versus Tom Crean.
Yeah.
You start noticing that, even though Crean battles back from his first regression and goes back into that top 5%, he drops, that regression, and the way that the way the regression worked did not necessarily, or I'm sorry, Tony Bennett.
Yeah.
That regression, the way that worked, just didn't really help Crean overcome that what happened after losing in the Sweet 16, where the fan base was disappointed that they didn't reach their full potential in the NCAA tournament, as well as going and looking like a contender that last year, and then dropping out as fast as it did. And whereas Bennett was able to his regression wasn't nearly as difficult, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's also, again, it's just the stability of the rosters, plays such a huge role in all of this, and just maintaining recruiting. If you remember, after that 2013 roster core left, recruiting got very rocky at IU at that time. Yeah. It didn't completely collapse, but it's just that it was sort of like hit or miss in ways that it did not happen for Tony Bennett. Tony Bennett's recruiting, after he had this spike up to around 30 wins, he basically stayed up there, and his recruiting actually improved.
Right.
And eventually leading to think about the divide between where Bennett is ascending and Crean is sort of collapsing in his last years. Bennett's pulling in the core of his eventual national championship team, which is Kyle Guy and DeAndre Hunter and Ty Jerome and all those guys. Whereas Crean is going the opposite direction. He's losing all of his prime A recruits. I mean, that 2017 class kind of was what sunk him. Remember, he offered 21 of the top 50 recruits that year in that class. He missed on all of them. And the state of Indiana had, Scruggs and Wilkes and all those really good players. He missed on all of them. So yeah, it's kind of the story that, we've told before about how recruiting and roster construction really just sort of drives, the ceiling or floor of where your program is going. And, in the case with, comparing Tom Crean to Tony Bennett, I mean, that's just like a perfect illustration of that. if you look at the breakdown of the between those guys, the sorry, I'm just pulling this up. The comparison with those guys. Well, actually, we'll get that too. We'll pull that up in segment 2, right?
Well, and I think where I'm going, because I want to hop over to KenPom before we take the break real quick, because I want to show two programs where we have a similar type of programs that have had a moment. You look at San Diego State, who was the national runner-up
Right.
2 seasons ago. And you can kind of see where they've gone from, and you can argue, okay, their KenPom's 14. Well, no, they're definitely in the top 2% of programs because of where they ended up. And then moving down, now they may be looking at just entering tier 4.
Mm-hmm.
And can they bring back what they brought, what they've done in the past? Can they solidify themselves this season? Any way you look at it, they're seeing a bit of a regression. I think in mid-major or somewhat medium high major conferences, which I think you can call the Mountain West, kind of something like that.
Yeah.
Those next levels over to the power conferences, it may be you may see more of that regression happening. Like those regressions may be more stark, but you look at certain programs that may be fresh on your tongue, like a San Diego State.
Mm-hmm.
Much like we were talking about South Carolina yesterday, where South Carolina is in the middle, you're seeing a bit of a regression, putting them on regression watch with all they lost in the portal.
Yeah, they lost Michi Johnson and a lot of the core of the kids that had them way above their normal line last year.
And San Diego State has lost, I think, a pretty good amount in the portal. There been this continuity. I mean, and that's the danger of some of these teams in conferences like the Mountain West. Or even Power 5 or Power 4 conferences and Power 5, because you don't want to throw the Big East on that. If you're a lower, like if you're not a program that has as much firepower with NIL in particular, that you may start finding your guys going on to other programs after a good year with you. And so you're constantly having to rebuild or reload.
Yeah, those mid-tier conferences definitely are susceptible to that, right? Yeah, I mean, the Mountain West, and the WCC. I mean, I think those two conferences probably get coaches from the Power 5 schools. I think definitely look to those two conferences for pulling guys out, and you've definitely seen a lot of that the last year or two.
And that's again, St. Mary's. I'm not sure, like their men's continuity is pretty good, but even resulting in that, you're seeing a team that they're replacing a lot. So you may be looking at a program that if their early season doesn't net the wins they need, they may be looking at not making the tournament. Like if they go to Nebraska and they lose to Nebraska in a big way, that's not going to help them as the season progresses. So they may be a 23, 24 win team, 25 win team. I'm not saying they're going to miss the tournament, but they're more likely to miss the tournament at 25 wins than, let's say, a program like Ohio State if they made it to 25 wins.
Of course. Yeah, they typically have to be up in the high 20s, getting close to the 30s to make sure that they're completely safe. And look what they lost. I mean, their point guard, the best player they had.
Yeah.
Who is he the point guard for now? He's a point guard for UConn.
Okay. There you go.
So I mean, we're talking about poaching kids. The best program in the country went and poached away their best player. Yeah. So you're right. I mean, that's the challenge of these schools. It's like you feel like you're almost like a AAA baseball team. It's like it's like we want to get good, but if we get too good, then we're going to start losing players up to the big leagues.
Yep. And so there are programs that are poaching. And there are programs that are rebuilding and reloading at the same time. Teams that are coming out of a regression. And when we come back, we're gonna talk about some of those programs and how they're doing it and how it's potentially looking for some of them.
Welcome back to X's and Joe's. I'm Mike Wiemuth, joined by Coach Bob Moats. So now we talked about teams on the downslide. Now let's talk about the happy stuff. Teams on the rebound. And just take a look at what, what it looks like for teams that are basically emerging from a regression, which again we said is one of the biggest keys for a coach and a program to maintain some kind of stability, and also making sure that as a coach you get that fat contract and you don't become the next studio host on the ESPN college basketball.
Find yourself doing the Southwest Nebraska Barbers Teachers and Barbers College game versus Kansas State on Peacock Peacock free trial.
Have you ever noticed, like, you're watching a game and it's like it's a new college basketball season, and you hear these announcers and like, that guy sounds familiar. I can't place him, but he sounds familiar. I know I've heard that voice before. And then after the first or second time out, they do the little hit where they're doing like the on-camera chat, and they have like the person's name. They're like, wait a minute, he was coaching at South Carolina like 3 years ago.
3 years ago, yeah, there he is.
Months ago.
His wife had enough of him being around the house, so she says, "Get out of here, get on a plane, and go talk about this stuff."
Yeah,
because you're yelling at the squirrels in the backyard to get them on the line or something ridiculous. It's like,
yeah,
you just can't do this.
Yeah, no, it is funny, but yeah, it almost seems like just a rotational expectation that coaches that get canned. Do you think they get called right away? Do you think like the studio people are like, hey, I heard the bad news, but
your press conference was epic in the meltdown, and we think you'd be great on TV.
People definitely tune in to watch you.
Yeah. You're a draw right now. Let's capitalize on it.
Yes,
Here, yeah.
Let's make sure this 15 minutes lasts as long as possible.
Here's your Synergy Media credentials and your Ken Palm, and try to figure out what this team's going to do. I've never heard of any of these kids. Doesn't matter. No one's watching.
Yeah.
So what does it look? So I think how some have rebounded from the fall. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, and I think what's important to realize is this is where your research on talent over the years, and it's just another reinforcement of it, that always be recruiting.
Yeah.
Always be
closing.
Always be closing. Exactly.
Glenn Ross taught us.
Exactly. And that, if you've ever been in a sales room, that's the God's honest truth.
Yeah.
You're always having to do it. But I think the key is, as you go on, and as we kind of look at this with the Bennett, where he had a regression, but then you talked about Jerome, you talked about Kyle Guy, you talked about those players coming in, and then Cree not being able to land a high level point guard.
Yeah, and
we're talking like a high level college point guard.
Yeah, after Yogi, right?
After Yogi Ferrell.
We think about it. This is a thing that and it's good that you bring that up, Bob. I think a lot of times fans look at it like the NBA, like free agency. Obviously, the portal kind of gives you a little bit of that feel, but if you're recruiting for college and you're trying to make sure that 24 months from now we know that this slot is going to be opening up. What do you do in the high school ranks to make sure that you have someone ready? Well, you have to hit on a pretty good player that can come in when they're a junior and just slide right over. And so that's the interesting thing about like the Yogi Ferrell story, is that as soon as Tom Crean got Yogi, he missed on every single one of the other high school point guard recruits he had in the 4 years that Yogi was there. I mean, all the top kids that he went after basically went elsewhere. Right. And so that's why by the time you get there, it's like, oh crap, Yogi's leaving. Who can we get? Well, you kind of had to settle on a guy that had a major knee injury and was basically kind of on the downslide of his career, even though he gave his all. That was kind of what the market was available for you once you missed on all of your key recruiting targets. Right.
And so as you go on, do we have another slide after this?
Moving that over. So,
because if we want to jump quickly, kind of talk about that you're looking at bringing in new folks, and now with the portal, there are some programs that have utilized the portal, and we're going to talk about one in particular. I think is of particular interest to most folks who listen to this show. If you want to hop over to Ken Palm real quick. The minutes continuity with IU is a little deceiving, I think, because you're looking at a program that is, I think, has replaced 3 starters and has done so with I wouldn't call it a brand new backcourt, but it's darn close.
Right.
When you look at their backcourt minutes in particular, they've definitely kicked up. They've got a different dynamism in their backcourt than what they've had in the recent past.
Right.
And the big win against South Carolina, which you talked about at the opening of the show, was one that really kind of helped us through there. I use a team that's coming out of a regression. And I always argue, and Mike, you and I have talked about this a couple times, definitely off. When they brought Mike Woodson in, he was not necessarily your traditional hire in that he was taking over after a regression and the regression had no real way of getting out.
Right.
That was more of an anomaly bump for Archie Miller. May have been COVID related, was definitely recruiting related. But if you look at the numbers there, Archie Miller had a group coming in. Like the 2020 year, IU was a 20-win team and was projected to make the tournament.
Yeah.
They were supposed to do it the next season, and then the bottom dropped out at the end of the season. So then they fire Archie Miller, bring in Mike Woodson. Woodson basically inherits Archie Miller's last 2 years.
Basically, yeah.
And the pivot for Woodson, which makes it so difficult for a coach to do, was that he had to first finish out what was kind of already kind of not a very high ceiling when you're looking at a program like Indiana. They're firmly in the 3rd tier. So they're a program, or not even firm, they were firmly in the 3rd tier. Now they moved from being a bubble type team, a high seed type team, to trying to get into the top 5%. Woodson basically gets them there with the 4 seed season with Miller's guys, with a few guys that he brings in.
Yeah.
But then had to also simultaneously almost make the program, would you call it almost regression proof?
Yeah. We're just, let's say regression mitigation, let's say.
You had to mitigate, yeah.
Yeah. Because again, like regressions are going to happen, right? So
right.
What you're trying to do is just make sure that you're not falling into a pit. You're trying to go from like, okay, it's gonna drop. Let's have a 20 to 25 Ken Palm drop, not a 50 to 70 Ken Palm drop. That's kind of what that's kind of the way you have to think about it if you're a coach.
Right. And so last year was a fairly substantial drop from that sort of 2nd, 3rd tier, well into the 4th tier, missed the tournament even with 19 wins. And you're looking at, I wouldn't call it an overhaul of the roster, but they definitely moved they had some fairly major upgrades in some positions with Rice Carlisle bringing in Bryson Tucker, Omar Ballo, obviously, to replace Khalil Ware. You have a bunch of different, players being brought in the portal, where you're able to pair them with some of the guys you brought in Malik Renew and Mackenzie Mbako and Trey Galloway.
Right. You
now have a solid 8. You bring in Luke Goody from Illinois. And you still have some guys that we're not really sure at with Cups, Hatton, who is a transfer also, Ja'Kai Newton with his health. Anthony Leal is still sitting on that bench also. So you have some, so it appears like you have some, you have more tools available to you. And the early results, small sample size of 3 games, they're definitely performing at a better rate than they were a year ago.
Right.
And so if you're looking at programs that are kind of that are looking to, coming out of a regression, and I think IU is a program where that regression was fairly stark.
Yeah. Well, I had texted you before in some of our private conversations, like 50, like Ken Palm drops of 50 or more typically are pretty deadly for coaches. Like if you go back in history, in the pre-portal era. Yeah, I mean, I was going through and and going through like literally every single coaching scenario that I had on my Excel spreadsheets, I can only come up with a handful of guys that had a Ken Palm 50 drop in, say, like year 3 or 4, that were still coaching that same school like year 5 or 6. I mean, like when I say handful, I mean like literally like I could count on one hand number. But that's in the pre-portal era. Now, obviously, with the portal, it does have this like buoying effect for schools that have the money to get the players, right?
Right.
And so in the way it used to be, you had to drop like that. Okay, man, we're really struggling. Our roster's not great. Now we need to really like ramp up recruiting. Let's go get the best high school players we can. Oh, the high school players are not coming now because they saw that drop and they're really not pleased, and they don't think that you're going to still be there when when they're like a junior or senior.
Right.
Portal comes around. Now it's completely different. Now you have the opportunity to bring in kids in a scenario where, hey, look, we just need we just need to get up right now, and we've got enough resources to be able to invest in you to be able to come in and make this big quick change. And now that's why you have IU in a place where they're they're the top 20 right now. That would have been almost inconceivable in the pre-portal era to have that kind of drop and just that quickly remount yourself into a AP top 20 team.
Well, I just popped up UCLA for a similar sort of definitely jumping on the regression. And I'm going to kind of rely on you a little bit to kind of walk us through UCLA a little better, because you're looking at a team that after COVID was a Final Four team. Mick Cronin takes over right at, going into the Cronin season, or the right into the COVID season. Alford gets fired, I think during the Romeo Langford year. Is that correct?
For yes, IU? I believe, that would have been true.
Cronin comes in from the University of Cincinnati. They have it's kind of a slight increase, moving into that, definitely moving up in that fourth group. And then he jumps them in 21, 22, and 23 firmly into the top 5%.
Yeah.
And then last year, with all the replacements, because if you look at their team last year, their regression, a lot of it had to do with minutes continuity, bringing a lot of freshmen in, especially freshmen in a time where you actually have more experienced teams in the Pac-12 and beyond.
Right.
They just weren't able to get it together, and they go from a top 2% program, people putting them in the Final Four in their brackets, to all the way solidly in the fourth quartile or quintile.
And they're 16 and 17 last year, so they were well below the team to be.
And with some of the guys that they kept, I think they let some guys go in the portal. There are some guys that aren't working out.
Yeah,
they brought some other guys in the portal.
Yeah, they lost that. Adam Bona went to the Sixers, and they lost a few other kids going out. And
I think Cronin kind of looked at this and said, okay, we have to hit a hard reset.
Yeah.
And more so, I think, than Mike Woodson on a hard reset, I might add, that he's looking at this from, okay, how do we get our teams to defend the way we need to defend? Because when you look at Mick Cronin, it is offense. There are some similarities in their 3-point attempts, between IU and UCLA, and conversion rates, all of those factors. But the biggest one for me, I think, is just the fact that you have two programs here, two legacy programs that are able to leverage their name, leverage their assets, and be able to rebuild quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. They were
able to quickly. Reload. I mean, it's a rapid fire,
Yeah. No, exactly. They, I mean, UCLA was poaching within their own conference. I mean, they stole probably one of the best young players in the whole of the old Pac-12.
The conference formerly known as.
Yeah, exactly. But in the old Pac-12, the probably one of the best young players outside of Miles Rice at Washington State was the Tyler Bilodeau from Oregon State.
Right.
And now he's probably UCLA's best player. So they poached him. They stole Kobe Johnson from USC. They literally took a player from their chief rival. And then they also brought in Sky Clark, who all of us remember. I mean, Clark, remember, was at Illinois.
Yep.
Transferred to Louisville and now is transferred again to UCLA. And Clark's now, I think he's technically doing most of the point guard work for them. So yeah, I mean, he's gotten some names. He's definitely brought in some players that were in high demand.
And you can argue in both of these. You bring up Bilodeau in particular because Oregon State, Washington State are kind of like, they're the ones who got caught in the musical chairs games without a chair holding the hand grenade. I mean, those programs are screwed right now, and will be for the foreseeable future. Sky Clark goes through a coaching change, so the new guy, he's like, we're out of Louisville, let's go someplace else.
Right.
So I think with all of these guys, you're looking at, there may be some unique situations where it could be replicable, it may not be replicable.
Yeah.
And not everybody's doing it the same way, because if we look at another team that's coming out of a fairly longer regression, and if you're watching this, you're seeing I'm scrolling down KenPom to try to find them. Let's find
a bad sign.
There we go.
The third mouse wheel twirl.
Right.
You don't want to be there.
So here we are at Notre Dame with Micah Shrewsbury in his second year.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that he inherited a disaster, but Mike Bray in those last seasons, it wasn't great. And Mike Bray, if you go and you look at him over the course of his tenure, had a very long tenure at Notre Dame, very successful by any stretch for most programs, back-to-back Elite Eights in 2015, 2016. And then even though he had guys like Blake Wesley coming in, even though he had guys like Konstantinsky coming in, they still just weren't able to be as competitive in the ACC as they needed to be. And Bray actually stepped out of that job himself.
Right.
And Notre Dame, because Penn State didn't lock down their guy, Micah Shrewsbury ends up back in his, basically back in his old neighborhood of South Bend, Indiana, where he got his coaching start at IU South Bend, I might add.
Yep.
And he's now building traditionally through the high schools, more the high school than anywhere else.
Right.
He's
got 4 kids signed for next year.
And it's a monster class.
Yeah. Especially for Notre Dame.
Notre Dame.
Harrelson is one of the first top 20 recruits they've had in quite a while. And then, Frost, Ainhert, and Kohler are those guys are, those are kind of your 4-year, 100, around 100-ish, players. And offensively minded. I think it's interesting. I think he's really leaning in, obviously, to his theory about really finding the kind of kids that are going to fit in his very offensive-minded system. And I'm interested to see what he does in the portal, like how much he does, because it looks like if you're signing 4 kids in high school, then that means you're probably not going to be going as heavy into the portal as maybe a lot of other coaches would.
Well, and he's got a team of sophomore. I'm looking at the players right now on the KenPom. You can see it. He's got a lot of guys who are sophomores and juniors.
Right.
And so if you go back to that, what we were talking about in segment 1, where that traditional build where year 1, you see, you're kind of coming out of the regression. Year 2, you kind of see maybe some sparks. Year 2, you start seeing some climb up. By year 3, like this year, if Notre Dame keeps doing what they're doing, like what they did to Georgetown yesterday on an away game was remarkable.
Yeah.
And if they can keep winning, finding ways to win. Let's say they have a good showing against Houston, a good showing against Alabama. Let's say that they end up with better than 500 in the ACC. You could see a team that was sitting last year well out of KenPom, well under 500, or well out of the well out of the where a Power 5 program was to be with whether it's KenPom, Torvik, or the sort of tiers. you have a program now that's battled their way into a high seed, but they're now back in the tournament.
Right.
And it's something they haven't seen a whole lot of since Mike Bray's, since the end of the Mike, since really the middle of the Mike Bray run.
Right.
So that's, I look at a team like Notre Dame and seeing that they're looking traditionally, and you're right, because are they going to look for some people in the portal, or are they going to maybe try to lock their people down like a Marquette locks their kids down,
right,
and keeps their kids on campus as much as possible, versus picking up a few free agents here and there. And NIL factors into that, branding factors into that.
right.
But the one thing we learned in the Harrelson recruitment, Micah Shrewsbury is a very engaging coach on the recruiting trail, whether it's a shorter or long-term recruitment. Kids want to play for it.
Yeah.
And that to me is one that's, interesting to look at.
Yeah. When we talk about, we talked about on the show before, the factors of what kids consider when they're looking at a program. Shrewsbury is one of those coaches that really maximizes the style points in terms of like, okay, they play a very particular style that is fun, reasonably identifiable. People actually know that the coach is known for that style. And so, yeah, I could see where a lot of offensively minded kids that want to play in, shoot a lot of threes basically, and play very quote unquote modern style basketball. That's going to be very attractive to a lot of kids. Now, a lot of kids may not like South Bend. they may not
Right.
like the party atmosphere at Notre Dame versus some other places, but other kids will. And obviously other kids are going to like the fact that, you're at a great institution. Notre Dame has obviously got great academics. So again, it's that whole balance sheet of considerations kids look at. And yeah, but I think at least that variable, the variable of style, I think Shrewsbury is going to score pretty high on, as long as his teams again keep producing and having games played in the 80s and 90s versus other teams that are playing that don't win as much, i.e. Archie Miller, when they're played in like the 50s and 60s.
Right. And I think as we go on to, and another team that's kind of showing that as well with Cincinnati, with Wes Miller.
Yeah.
That's another program that he inherited a disaster. And now you're seeing what a traditional build out of a regression, or really their regression was already happening when Brannen took over for Cronin.
Right.
He inherits Mick Cronin's regression. And then Wes Miller comes in while the program's, bottomed out, and over his first 4 seasons is on that traditional ramp back up to that looks like the trajectory of a coach that's going to maybe be successful.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can tell like right now, I think Cincinnati is ranked 17th or something like that, or at least like the AP. I know that's what they're ranked.
AP 17th, KenPom 11, Torvik's probably similar to that.
Yeah, so they're definitely spiking up, and what's most impressive is that especially in this era, is that they're able to get a good balance of good high school players and portals. I mean, they swiped Dylan Mitchell from Texas, and I know he was a very high priced portal player. They got the coach is from Butler. And IU was taking a look at that kid for a while too, and he's definitely a very high skilled, definitely, and especially on the offensive end. And also Jizzle James, I think he has the best name in college basketball.
That's the greatest name ever.
He is like first team All-American for names. So like,
well, hell, he's putting up first team All-American numbers right now too. I mean, geez,
exactly.
He's playing 2/3 of the minutes with an offensive rating of 131.2.
Yeah.
I mean, that's assist rate of 30%. This kid looks like, now granted they've played nobody,
yeah.
but they're beating the crap out of nobody. That's the important thing. So
yeah, I mean, those are some of the challenges, down the road, but yeah, but you're right. I mean, what we said before is when you're in the first 4 years of the tenure, that's that's the whole honeymoon and chip stack conversation, is that you really are trying to ramp up as much as possible before you get to that first regression. Because, again, regression is going to happen, right? So it is like, if you can get up to like 28, 29 wins, or you can get some kind of hardware, it doesn't have to be like a national championship. It can be like a Final Four visit or a very deep tournament run, maybe a conference tournament, or just the regular season conference championship. Getting something in that first 4-year window, or 5, depending upon the school, is really important, because once that first regression happens, that's kind of where people's perceptions of like what your ceiling is start to lock in. So if you're at like 30 wins, like, hey, yeah, we dropped back, but this guy's shown he's already won 30 games before, we can ramp back up. It's when you're too far below that is where the fan base and the media starts thinking, and especially the recruits start thinking, yeah, maybe this guy, this is kind of where he's maybe topped out at whatever level he's at.
And what's scary for a school like Cincinnati, for those of you watching and playing at home, you'll see the Big 12 conference, much like the Big 12, much like the ACC, much like the SEC. In some respects, for some programs, it may be a little harder to build that just based on who's in the conference. You have Kansas, Houston, Arizona, Baylor, all these programs that we talk about a lot on this show.
Right.
Because they are at the top of they've been traditionally at the top of the college basketball thing. I mean, you look at the top 7 teams in the Big 12, and they're all in the top 5%. Right. And BYU is standing outside of it. Bobby Hurley's Arizona State is in the 4th tier. And they've actually had some wins and shown some acumen over the last couple of years at least.
Yeah.
So when we come back, we're going to wrap this thing up, talk briefly about the mitigation a little more, maybe a couple programs like that may be stagnated a little bit. And should fans come to expect, can us as fans expect that regression mitigation when we come back on X's and Joes?
Welcome back to X's and Joes. I'm Mike Wiemuth, joined by Coach Bob Moats. So, Bob, wrapping up, how do you avoid all this? Or at least, how do we mitigate this in terms of regressions? What can programs do to make sure that, knowing that a regression is going to happen, how do you feather bed the blow, so to say? Like you're trying to make sure that, okay, when this happens, we're going to bounce back very quickly, and the depth of the decline is going to be somewhat limited.
So we're back to this year is going to be very telling. And I think we've seen some of the clues of that over the course of this recruiting cycle, where not everyone's just gone all in on the portal. Right. You're still seeing a very vibrant high school recruiting effort by multiple programs where they're putting in large amounts of resources. And I think the real conversation now is, well, if you have a guy for 2 years, at the end of those 2 years, you're going to know if you want to keep him or you want to allow him, you're going to do everything you can to keep the kid or allow him to move on. Right. You're going to have coaching changes. I think coaching changes are going to continue to be, you're not going to have a whole lot of situations where coaching job security is not improved in this new environment. If anything, I think it's going to be it's going to be a quicker trigger finger.
Oh yeah. Well, we've said before that, traditionally, it was like presidential administrations. Like you give the guy 4 years and you wait, and then after that you decide, yeah, we're going to keep him or we're going to kick him out.
Or being the White House chief of staff would be another way to look at it. It's like, hey, if you're not working after 6 months,
exactly, you're gone.
Don Regan, you're out. Howard Baker, you're in. Let's go.
Yeah, yeah. And the portal obviously just has completely shrunk all that. I mean, one of the prior episodes we talked about how often fans were referencing Kansas State and Missouri, those portal years where they jumped, had like 10 win improvements from the prior year. So once you have that, that's like the curve has been set now for the rest of the class. Like, okay, Like that's what you're being judged against. You're not being judged against, what happened 15 years ago. You're being judged against sometimes programs with less resources than you having all these like huge ramp ups in talent and improvement. Okay. You have to hit that line. And if you don't, well, we're not going to think very well of you.
And you could go out your front door and right now talk to probably 10 random people in your neighborhood about a program in your backyard and understand what that looks like. I mean, Kyle Neptune, it's going to be a question of, well, we don't want to go back to where we were pre-Jay Wright. So do we make the move now? Do we make the move later?
Yeah.
Porter Moser may have a similar conversation in Oklahoma, just because they've kind of leveled. I think Michigan State and Iowa may be, I wouldn't call them mired in a regression, but they're maybe at a plateau point, especially the age of their coaches.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how much longer does a Fran really want to have to go out there and do it?
Yeah.
Does Izzo really want to keep working in this environment? Tony Bennett had that revelation to himself, as he was going through this, going, I just don't have it in me anymore.
Yeah.
I think it's also true where I think a couple years before that, Jay Wright, which sets up the Neptune situation. So mitigating that regression now for a lot of these guys that were used to being college coaches is going to be a hard step to take.
Yeah.
And I also think that as fans, understanding that you may see more, like you saw with UCLA and IU, their regression may be a lot deeper just because something just didn't mesh.
Yeah.
And so you may see so instead of seeing one tier going down, you may see 2 or 3 tiers going down and then having to build back up utilizing the portal and then revamping your high school recruiting strategy.
Right.
However that works.
Yeah.
I also think it's really going to be hard if you have a class that busts to come back from it.
Yeah.
Even with the portal, I think it's going to be hard to do that.
Yeah, the opportunity costs are just so high now, right?
Because unless you're going to clean house for that next year, it's riskier in some respects cleaning house than it is trying to stick with guys.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, and it's not like, the talent pool is bigger, the players are better, but that's also relative. The ceiling is also higher. I mean, Cooper Flagg is a freak. It's like,
right.
Chet Holmgren, same thing. I mean, you start looking at the top of the tier versus what it was even a decade ago, and it's a whole different ballgame. So, I don't know. I think how do you make yourself regression mitigated or regression proof? You're going to have to look at it from a thing where, all right, you're always going to have juniors would help. I think.
Yeah.
Can you get a couple of portals? And then making sure that your core 8, you can keep them happy.
Yeah.
And then below that, and especially with the scholarships going up, I mean, who's going to do it? I don't know. But you have a bunch of other guys underneath you that are going to be looking to kind of, okay, so of these 6 at the bottom, only 2 of you are going to go on past your junior year. The other 4, you can go, we'll let you go elsewhere.
Yeah, you almost want to mimic the kind of stability of the programs of the past in terms of, let's say, the inflow and outflow. We've talked about churn rate on here before. Mm-hmm. Churn rate is not good in terms of teams that have high churn rates. That's the problem that Calipari had. It's great to have all that talent, but if you're constantly bringing in 6, 7 new guys, and those guys being like your top 6, 7 players, you just have a new cast every single year. That's just very hard to overcome some of the deficits you're going to have in terms of all the coaching stuff, continuity, familiarity, all those things that we've discussed before. So I think that using multi-year portal players is probably one of the easiest ways to just to kind of normalize your churn rate, even if you are using the portal pretty frequently. So if you get some guys, and that's why I said that someone like guys like Rice, Miles Rice at IU is a great addition because there's at least the potential that he's going to come back. If you can have high-end portal players that stay for 2 years, maybe even 3, then you're golden. You're just as good a position of stability as some of the teams of the past that had just really good high school recruiting. So if you can just keep doing that, now if you can do it at the right frequency, that's like the challenge. Like, can you do that
Right.
for all the positions? It's not just doing that for one position, saying, okay, all right, we did it. It's like, no, you have 7 positions to fill in for a 7-man rotation. How many of those are going to be those kind of players versus you're just churning players out or just swapping players in that don't have the talent or experience or both to fulfill the expectations.
And again, you look at return on investment. I mean, if you have $750,000 that you're going to give to a player, do you want to give it to the next Tristan Newton or do you want to give it to a top 25 freshman?
Yeah.
And we don't really know what the market rates are. You can look at Trilly, you can look at sometimes what the rumors that fly all over the place as to this guy's getting $6 million in the deed to the student union. Half of it's crap. The other half of it's really just
a lot of it's agent bluster to drive up the cost,
to drive up market
the
cost.
offer at the next school that they're going to be talking to.
Right. And those guys are going to get found out too, that, you may get a mercenary for a year that's going to just pop around college basketball, get enough credits, to get his general studies degree.
Right.
And then, or not. And then, hopefully they've invested his, however much he's able to get post taxes in so that he can continue to, maybe be okay from an income standpoint, have life-changing money.
Yeah.
There'll be a few of those.
Yeah.
Just like there's a few journeymen in baseball, journeymen in football, journeymen in the NBA. It doesn't, and I don't think it's going to, but I think that mitigation factor we're talking about, it's going to be, they're going to be constantly evaluating and reevaluating who they have in there.
Right.
Which more so than they're doing as well. And I think the length of time it takes a coaching staff to determine what they're going to do with maybe a freshman or a sophomore is going to be significantly reduced.
Yeah.
And it's like, can we get somebody better now? Would a Lance Jones be better for us than an Ethan Morton? And there's going to be a lot of those types of questions being asked. If we can get Cannon Carlisle, can we let CJ Gunn go?
Yeah.
Those types of questions, those types of GM conversations are going to be more prevalent throughout the sport to help mitigate regressions, or at the very least recover from them much faster.
Well, what do you think the fan angle is going to be?
That's hard, because I think fans, it's going to just. I think it's going to have to be. I think fans' expectations are going to be higher. Yeah, and especially with multiple programs, and I think that like I said, I think their patience is going to run out faster on certain guys.
Yeah, well, I think that's a distinction. I don't know if their expectations are going to change. I just think the time frame is going to be totally different.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah,
it's like if you're at a program you expect to go to Final Fours, like that won't change. Like, now with a portal, we now want to go to national championship every year. It's just that you're going to want to go to Final Fours, but you want to go now. Like
they're not going to give them
4 years for this. Like this has to happen like this year or next.
Circling back to Kurt Signetti.
Yeah. Well,
that's what's, and not, you can't expect that, but you're not going to get I'm going to come in here and in 3 years, I'm going to build you a winner.
Yeah.
It's going to be, what are you going to do now to reverse the trend?
Right.
You may not get there, but what are you doing to reverse the trend now? You're not going to get maybe 2 years of a plateau at the bottom and then ramp up like Tom Crean had.
Yeah.
I think that era is over and done.
Yeah.
And I could be wrong on that. That could be a hot take that we don't like, but that we don't really like to do. But I think it's analytically fan psychology, as we talk about it, it's like things are accelerating. And
we discussed comparison bias, and when you have examples like I said, the Missouri and Kansas State examples on basketball, then of course, like Kirk's. I've heard from other college football fans that are like not IU people that are talking about Kirk Signetti in the context of their conversations about how disappointed they are with their football coaches. Yeah. Oh, look, our guy's been here 3 or 4 years. Look what Signetti's doing at Indiana. Don't tell us if it takes us 4 years. That guy's doing it in 4 months.
Right. And that I think, there's about 8 Big Ten coaches who are basically, sweating going, crap, what this guy doing to us? He's killing us here.
It is like when you have your classroom and everyone like performs a certain level. And then that transfer kid comes in that
It just
is like a
blows up
perfect
the
straight A student,
blows up the curve.
destroys the curve. That's
400 hitter, varsity quarterback, class. He will be the class president, and he drives a Mercedes, and he's got 35 in range and can dunk a basketball. He's Jack Armstrong, the All-American boy, and your boy world has just been blown up, and your girlfriend just left you for him. Yeah, this guy is not making you any happier.
Exactly.
So on that note, thanks to Bob Thompson for the music and sound of the show. And special thanks to John Ringer of rigdesign.com for designing our logo and look of the show.
Yeah. And looking forward to next episode 22, Tempo with Tonsoni and Tony. How programs try to use pace of play to their advantage. Our pals, Coach Brian Tonsoni and Tony Adrania, will be joining us to talk about pace. And I'm sure we'll no doubt veer into conversations about football, basketball, Thanksgiving dinner stories, and all the rest that we do when we get together. So yeah, look for that. Probably maybe the last days of November, maybe even early December, but about 2 weeks from now. So
yeah, expect kind of a Thanksgiving conversation after you go through all the feast week activities, which that could be an interesting conversation between the four of us to kick off, and go through there. But I would say I'm excited about getting coach on the show with us, just to kind of veer into a topic that we all talk about, but we don't really. I think a lot of fans misunderstand with Tempo.
Right. Yeah.
That it's not always what the analytics show. It's not always what the numbers show, because you cannot tell me on any planet that Micah Shrewsbury and Dan Hurley want to play slow.
Yeah.
But their possessions look like this.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we'll definitely have some good examples. And I know, Tony will certainly have some interesting perspectives.
And Coach will too, from a philosophical standpoint.
Yeah, exactly. Tony will definitely have some good thoughts about the logic behind it.
And all of us kind of coming together of how you kind of get a team to play that way, because I've got a bunch of 12-year-olds I'm trying to do this with right now. And sometimes I feel like I'm bashing my head against a concrete wall.
Yeah.
Because, you'd think it's easy, but it really isn't. And it does have something to do with shot selection too, Mike. Your favorite thing.
Oh, God. I may have to bring some brandy or something if I hear shot selection.
We'll make sure you're medicated and lubed up for that, my friend.
We need to come up with a different term. That's our task. We're going to come up with a new term that will replace shot selection. Just because,
the ambition of X's and Joes.
Yes, exactly. We'll come up with our own glossary. So, oh man. So until then, this endless conversation was brought to you by the Back Home Network. Be sure to check out all the great BHN content, including Assembly Call, Doing the Work, Right Up Meridian, The Dribble Drive, and Crimson Cast on YouTube and BackHomeNetwork.com. So until next time, I'm Mike Wiemuth.
And I'm Bob Moats.
Have a good one, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving.